And I know I can rely on each and every one of you to walk with me as we continue.
On what seemed like an ordinary night in the Apostolic Palace, a profound stillness enveloped the atmosphere. The marble floors flickered faintly in the candlelight as the city of Rome rested under the gentle cloak of darkness. Inside the Pope's private chapel, however, something inexplicable was unfolding. There was an unusual hush, a tension that seemed to fill the space. Distinct from mere silence, it felt as if the room were holding its breath. Alone in prayer, Pope Leo XIV suddenly sensed it. Something off-kilter interrupted his rosary. Just as he contemplated the sensation, an unearthly light erupted in the chapel. This was no soft, warm glow. Instead, it was a searing white brilliance that caught him off guard, forcing him to shield his eyes. In that instant, he sensed the presence of something divine. The air thickened, transporting him away from the mundane and into a realm beyond comprehension. And then he saw him, not the gentle figure so often depicted in art, but an overwhelming presence. Jesus Christ, not as mere shepherd or victim, but in his full and terrifying resurrection glory. His essence seemed to extend far beyond the chapel's walls, and when their gazes met, Leo felt laid bare. In that instant, every thought, fear, sin, and intention of his life was exposed. He felt like a child, vulnerable and unworthy, yet fully understood. Dropping to his knees, he trembled not from fear, but from an awe so intense it bordered on pain. Christ spoke softly, yet the words resonated deeper than mere sound, as if they vibrated within his bones and filled his entire being. It was a voice he felt in his blood and spirit. "I gave them the truth," Jesus revealed, his sorrow palpable. They turned it into an empire. The weight of those words hit Leo like thunder, leaving him gasping. With profound sadness, Christ elaborated, speaking not of enemies from without, but of betrayals from within the church itself. He unveiled secrets that lay hidden beneath the stones, adding layers to a message that resonated with a weight far greater than any anger could convey. I had an experience that changed everything for me, one that I never expected. It was early one morning, and there I was, lost in thought, when suddenly I felt a presence, a weighty, profound presence. Christ appeared before me, and I was both terrified and entranced. His face was striking yet familiar, marred and illuminated by a light that no artist could ever replicate. His expression was filled with a deep agony, not weakness, but the look of someone who had been waiting far too long to be heard. Even in that torment, love radiated from him. It was a powerful, infinite love, the kind that offers forgiveness while still holding us accountable. I found myself overwhelmed, tears streaming down my face, not just from guilt, but from the enormous responsibility resting on my shoulders. He spoke to me with authority, revealing what must be disclosed, and warning me of the consequences if the Church, failed to heed his words. "This judgment," he said firmly, "starts in my house." I never imagined I'd hear such a message, and the urgency in his voice left me shaken. Just like that, the vision vanished, plunging me back into the quiet of the room. But the stillness felt utterly transformed. Something fundamental had shifted. I remained there on my knees, unable to move, breath coming in ragged gasps. It was as if reality itself had changed. Something irreversible had begun to unfold. For hours I lingered in that chapel, unable to close my eyes, unable to voice any of the thoughts swirling in my mind. It wasn't just the vision that haunted me. It was the clarity of the command I had received. I had no choice now. I had to obey. When I finally stood before the College of Cardinals later that day, I barely resembled the man they had elected just weeks prior. My face was pale, and even as I projected a calm demeanor, my voice resonated with a chilling measure. I looked into the sea of crimson robes and began simply, "Christ appeared to me." Those words fell into the room like a thunderclap. It wasn't an apparition, no saint, no angel, but Jesus Christ himself. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. I continued, "He gave me a message that must be shared." The reactions were immediate and polarizing. Some whispered, recalling old prophecies about a pope chosen for a monumental revelation. Others pulled back in fear, shaken by the reality of the man they had elected being at the center of such divine communication. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of impending change. I can still remember the day everything changed for me. Within 24 hours, I found myself at the center of a storm. My name, once Leonardo Romano, barely known beyond the slums of Brazil, was suddenly on everyone's lips as Pope Leo XIV. I had stepped into the papacy, and with it came an awakening, a calling that I couldn't ignore. Back in Recife, my childhood was defined by stark contrasts. The wealthy lived in their lofty towers, while the poor were left to fend for themselves in the streets. My father worked the night shift at the docks, and my mother, a nurse, often returned home battered from breaking up fights among those trapped in addiction. From a young age, I had a front row seat to suffering, witnessing the pain etched on the faces of children abandoned on the streets, and the desperation in mothers who sacrificed their meals for the sake of their babies. When I became Pope, I carried that burden with me. I wasn't groomed for this role. I wasn't forged among the elite or trained in polished seminaries. Instead, my education came from dust, hunger, and sincere prayer. There were no grand expectations set for me. Many in the Vatican had never even heard of me, and those who had often dismissed me as just a people's priest, more at ease in muddy boots than in ornate vestments. But then, an experience transformed everything. In a moment of profound holiness, Jesus spoke to me. What I heard shook me to my core. I realized the Church had strayed from Christ's teachings, and I felt a sense of urgency to address this deviation. I couldn't shy away from delivering the message. There would be no diluting or softening what had been revealed to me. I stood firm, knowing the Church faced a reckoning if the hidden truths weren't brought into the light. As I shared my experience, the world reacted. Speculation buzzed like electricity in the air. What had been revealed to me? Was it tied to the elusive fourth secret of Fatima, a dire prophecy, a warning about corruption that had permeated the Church? Yet, the Vatican remained tight-lipped, and I, in my role as Pope, chose not to provide a written account. Instead, I embraced my role as a messenger of divine judgment, tasked with communicating a truth too vital to remain unspoken. Amidst all the chatter in churches, cafes, and online platforms asking what Jesus had shared, I felt the weight of my mission grow heavier. Despite the tumult, I was resolute. This wasn't merely about leading the Catholic Church anymore. It was about reshaping its course, one that prioritized truth over tradition and courage over comfort. While most teenagers were busy chasing their dreams, I found myself burying friends. Some died from overdoses, others simply vanished. In my world, God wasn't this far-off king shrouded in clouds. He had to be right here, in the midst of all the chaos, or he didn't feel real at all. By the time I turned 17, people began to notice me, not necessarily because I was special, but because I wouldn't stop talking about my faith. I preached everywhere I could, on street corners, on buses, in abandoned buildings, and even in parishes that barely had electricity. I didn't need a microphone. My voice cut through the noise, sharp, fast, and honest. Forget quoting long Latin passages or complex theological theories. I spoke about my neighbors, my own doubts, and the sins I carried. This authenticity clicked with others. They started to listen. I wasn't holy, just real, and I made it clear that God was watching, even when everyone else seemed to turn away. Stepping into the seminary stirred things up. My professors respected my unwavering faith, but many felt uneasy about my certainty. I believed the church needed to shift gears, stop just managing people and start feeling their pain again. I was vocal about hypocrisy, refusing to preach from behind the altar. Instead, I stood among the people. When it came time for my ordination, I made one solemn promise to my bishop. If I ever misrepresent the truth from the pulpit, I'd walk away from the priesthood. It wasn't an empty threat. I genuinely meant it. Over the years, that vow brought me both devoted followers and fierce opposition. My journey of ministry evolved against a backdrop of poverty, gang violence, and governmental corruption. I never waited for permission to enter areas deemed too dangerous for clergy, armed only with a Bible, a weathered rosary, and a level of conviction that left some feeling uneasy. I went where I felt needed. I performed exorcisms, some called them theatrical, and I offered communion to drug dealers, opened my rectory to those without homes, and spoke out against abuse within the church long before it became a trending topic. Paradoxically, the pushback only seemed to enhance my reputation, but it wasn't in Rome where I gained recognition. It was in the streets. When Pope Francis passed away, I was embedded in a medical mission in Bolivia, tending to children suffering from skin infections and burying another teenage girl who lost her life in a turf war. I didn't have ambitions to ascend to a throne. But then, news arrived that the conclave was forming, and to my astonishment, my name began to circulate among a small group of reformist cardinals. Some had quietly admired my work for years, while others had slipped into my parish in secret, observing from the shadows. There's a story that starts with a man everyone doubted, yet somehow he remained uncorrupted. People often said that maybe what the church truly needed was someone like him, untouched by the politics of Rome. When the time came for his vote in the Sistine Chapel, nobody expected him to achieve anything. In fact, he wasn't even sure if he would be allowed to cast a ballot. But as the voting unfolded, something extraordinary happened. His name began creeping up, gaining votes slowly at first, but then the momentum picked up speed. Some claimed it was a reaction to the long-established bureaucracy, while others whispered about it being a miraculous intervention. Ultimately, it didn't matter how it happened. On the fifth ballot, this barefoot priest from the slums, Leonardo Romano, found himself elected as the 267th Pope. The world blinked in surprise. Even the media was thrown off course. They scrambled to dig up information, only to find scant records and fuzzy cell phone videos of him preaching to storm-soaked villages and bringing healing to the sick in open-air gatherings. Then came the moment he stepped onto the papal balcony, as Pope Leo XIV. There wasn't a wave or a smile, just a steady gaze over the crowd as he uttered the words, "We begin again." His tone echoed pain and love, but something deeper lingered beneath. Observers felt a strange vibe permeating that night, something that stirred the air but didn't feel negative. It was as if he carried something heavier than the papal weight. It was a burden. Many attendees remarked he seemed older than his years, and his typically bright eyes flickered with an unrecognizable fear, as if a significant truth loomed over him. That's when the whispers began. It was said that he would spend hours staring out of chapel windows, deep in thought. Reports surfaced that he fasted for days and barely slept. A certain cardinal, who later spoke anonymously, revealed that during their initial meeting, the Pope posed a single question: "Do you believe God still speaks out loud?" It wasn't light-hearted banter, it was a challenge. When the cardinal hesitated, Pope Leo simply nodded, saying, "Then you're not ready for what's coming." This pope was nothing like his predecessors. He had no interest in appearances, regularly flouting established protocols. He welcomed janitors to participate in discussions on theology and chose to forego the opulence of the apostolic palace, transforming a guest wing into a home for single mothers. His reign didn't commence with grand ceremonies. It ignited like wildfire, and as the weeks rolled on, those who were closest to him felt the shift. There was something profoundly mystical about Pope Leo XIV's spiritual journey. Many noticed that his connection to the divine wasn't just intense, it was extraordinary. He would spend hours in solitude. Some people claimed that he was witnessing visions, while skeptics dismissed his experiences. Yet even his critics couldn't deny that he often seemed to possess a knowledge that was beyond ordinary understanding. He would predict obstacles before they even emerged, quoting scriptures that left others scratching their heads in confusion. It was as if he was in constant communion with a presence invisible to the rest of us. One bishop remarked, "It's like he's engaged in an ongoing conversation with someone we can't hear." So when he boldly declared that Jesus Christ had appeared to him, bringing a message that could transform everything, many were left in shock. But for some, this revelation wasn't a surprise. There was a sense that something monumental had been brewing inside him long before that moment. It began when the smoke turned white, marking a pivotal shift. People speculated that he wasn't merely elected, he was divinely chosen. On that fateful night, the chapel was enveloped in a silence that felt charged. It wasn't serene, it was heavy, the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing. Pope Leo XIV had entered these hallowed walls countless times before, wrestling with the heavy responsibility of his office. But on this particular night, he came not to speak, but to surrender. A certainty gripped him. Something significant was approaching. He knelt down and closed his eyes, not as part of a ritual, but as an act of yielding. And then it happened. There were no roaring storms or blinding lights. Instead, reality seemed to collapse in on itself. The air grew cold, and he felt a sudden rigidity in his spine. When he opened his eyes, he beheld Christ, not as the gentle figure we often envision, but as the powerful presence from the book of Revelation. His eyes were aflame with something that cut through all illusions, revealing unvarnished truth. The white robe Jesus wore exuded an almost unbearable purity. The sight of his face was both captivating and overwhelming. Pope Leo felt the weight of his own insignificance in the presence of the divine, not in shame, but in a profound realization. There stood the Creator, gazing at his creation, devoid of metaphor or symbolism. This was reality in its most astonishing form. At first, Jesus said nothing, simply absorbing Leo's presence with a piercing gaze. Each breath the Pope took felt like an unspoken admission, and the rhythm of his heart resounded like a call to judgment. And then, finally, Christ spoke, "Rome has forgotten me." The words washed over me like a tremor deep within my soul. Jesus spoke softly, yet each syllable held a weight that was impossible to ignore. "They have made my house a fortress," he said, and I suddenly felt like an outsider, locked out from something that should be welcoming. I remember freezing in place, unable to move, as his words pierced through me like arrows, exposing every hidden fear and all the comforts I had ever found in tradition. It was as if he stepped closer, and rather than anger, I felt a profound sorrow radiating from him, an ancient sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of time itself. "I came in mercy," he continued, recalling how he had sent his mother with warnings, giving us signs and ample time. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, stretching like the very fabric of space itself was being torn. His face remained calm, but I could sense the grief of nations reflected in his gaze. Then he spoke of betrayals hidden away within the walls of the Vatican. These weren't simple mistakes or misunderstandings. They were deep, festering betrayals. He didn't name anyone, but the weight of his accusations didn't need names. "There are those," he said, "who wear my cross but mock my name. They may reside in marble halls but turn a blind eye to the cries of the innocent. They pray in Latin, yet deny justice in their secretive chambers." I listened intently, almost motionless, as his words shaped themselves within me, becoming a heavy burden too sacred to shift. When he talked about the children, those innocent lives buried beneath silence, sold away in secrecy, I felt my heart shatter. "You shielded the shepherds," he said, "and let the lambs be slaughtered." Tears began to stream down my cheeks, not out of disagreement, but because deep down I understood the truth he spoke. I had seen reports. I had read the sealed documents. Though I hadn't personally committed these crimes, I realized I had become a steward of them. Silence equated to complicity, he made it clear. Then came the stark warnings. If the truth remains unspoken, Rome will face ruin, not symbolically or spiritually, but physically. The very stones would cry out, rivers would flood, and fire would engulf its domes. This wasn't merely a threat. It felt like a declaration of inevitable consequence. Judgment, he said, begins in the sanctuary. His patience was not a sign of weakness, nor was his silence indicative of absence. He reminded me that his mercy has limits. Each of his statements reverberated within me, not in anger, but rather heartbreak transformed into fierce resolve. Then he spoke of the saints, those who perished silently, those shamed into silence, whistleblowers buried in the depths of bureaucracy, women whose visions went unheeded, and priests cast aside for daring to reveal the truth. Here, amidst all of this, true prophets were often mocked. The weight of it all settled heavily in the atmosphere, leaving us all in stark reflection. I remember the moment it happened vividly. The air in the room seemed to thicken, almost like the walls were pressing in on me, not physically, but in a way that felt suffocating. Pope Leo XIV, trembling, listened as Christ delivered a message that would change everything. "You must open the vaults," he commanded, straightforward and devoid of ambiguity. This wasn't some poetic plea, it was an urgent directive. He insisted that the truth be revealed, no distortions or delays. Everyone deserved to know what had been hidden, not just the faithful, but everyone across the world. The message was clear. The impending judgment would not distinguish between those who believed and those who had ignored the truth. It wasn't just a call for the church. It was for nations that had turned a blind eye. There seemed to be a weight in those words, an unmistakable note of finality. Jesus, looking right at me, asked, "When I return, will I find faith?" There was no hint of rhetoric in his voice. It felt as if he was laying bare the expectation he held. The silence that ensued was more chilling than any rebuke he could have given. He didn't wait for a response because he already knew the answer. Then came his parting words. Those echoed in my mind long after he departed. "The blood of saints will not go unheard," he said, a thunderous yet tender warning that lingered in the air. With that, he was gone, and the vision shifted everything. It wasn't just a moment of revelation for me, it rocked the foundations of the Vatican itself. In the wake of his urgent call, I felt a wave of unrest sweeping through the grandeur of the Holy See. The older leaders, experienced in the arts of diplomacy and secrecy, managed to keep their fear hidden from the outside. But behind the stone walls, anxiety grew like wildfire. I could tell because the whispers started, murmured conversations bubbling under the surface, furtive glances exchanged during banquets, silent nods as we passed in the corridors. Initially, I had friends among the cardinals. They smiled at my ascension and congratulated me on my election. But suddenly, things changed. They began to avoid my gaze, and bishops who once applauded my dedication expressed doubts about my stability. The whispers turned darker, the tone shifted overnight. Those murmurs morphed into something more calculated as I pushed for the Vatican to open its archives, to reveal the truths long kept hidden from the faithful. What had begun as quiet discontent grew into a strategy that felt menacing. Not everyone opposed Pope Leo XIV. A small group of young reformers, particularly from Latin America and parts of Africa, stood firmly by his side. They yearned for a leader who would finally lift the shroud of silence that had enveloped the Church for decades. To them, Leo was the first pope brave enough to tackle the deep-rooted issues plaguing their faith. Unfortunately, their numbers were too few, and their support placed them in the crosshairs as well. Rumors soon began to circulate, especially a leaked letter from Cardinal Rossetti, a longtime Vatican insider known for his traditionalist views. He cautioned about instability stemming from the Pope's statements and subtly suggested that papal authority might need to be curtailed until things settled down. Although the letter never received official confirmation, it spread quickly, conveniently reaching both bishops and the media. That leak was no coincidence. It marked the opening salvo in what seemed to be an emerging silent conflict. The Vatican, always a place where facades masked deeper machinations, started revealing its underbelly. Inside the Secretariat of State, where much of the Church's diplomacy unfolds, clerics were scrutinizing the Pope's words, not for their doctrinal accuracy, but rather to identify any signs of vulnerability. One internal memo, intended to stay confidential, characterized Leo's messages as bordering on apocalyptic, hinting at prophetic delusions. Clearly, Someone wanted those words to be uncovered. Meanwhile, odd occurrences unfolded in the Apostolic Palace. A trusted aide of Pope Leo was abruptly reassigned without any explanation. Meetings the Pope had lined up were mysteriously shifted by outsiders, while important documents he sought from the archives seemed to vanish, only to be returned with key sections edited out. When he asked the archivist about it, the man could hardly make eye contact. "I was instructed," he murmured, but declined to reveal who had given those orders. Despite the mounting pressure, the reformers persevered. Cardinal Dominguez of Spain delivered a bold speech in front of a large crowd, calling on the Church to heed its conscience and embrace the heavenly message. Yet just a week later, he faced accusations of financial mismanagement from an anonymous report that dated back 2 years. Quite the coincidence. His committee positions were stripped away, and soon his influence faded. The message was clear: speak out, and you'd be silenced. But nothing could prepare anyone for what happened next. An audio recording surfaced on a lesser-known Catholic news site, allegedly featuring Pope Leo XIV discussing. I remember the moment vividly as I sat in my private quarters, a wave of emotion washing over me while trying to share what I saw. The tech wasn't great, the audio was choppy, and honestly, it felt like something out of a low-budget film. Yet it didn't take long for my vision to catch fire. In just a matter of hours, speculation erupted everywhere. Some commentators suggested I was slipping into madness, using terms like psychosis and religious delusions. It seemed the attack was on. As this storm brewed, I found my circle growing smaller. Those few aides I could trust became more difficult to reach. They assured me it was due to security reasons, that phone lines were being monitored and emails sifted through. But deep down I understood the truth. It was all about control. Despite my efforts to continue spreading messages of truth from the pulpit, the gears of the Vatican were quietly shifting against me. Something eerie hung in the air. The once vibrant echoes of Viva Papa gave way to hushed footsteps and sealed doors. Threats began to surface, not directly, never so blunt, but palpable nonetheless. One day I found a package in my quarters. No return address. Inside, a charred page from a Bible awaited me, accompanied by a chilling note that read simply, "Some secrets keep the world standing." There were no fingerprints, no clear suspects, but the warning was glaring. Another unsettling incident occurred when I discovered my room had been entered. Nothing was stolen, however. A crucifix had been flipped upside down on my desk. It felt personal, an intimate act intended to rattle me, which it did. Nevertheless, I pressed on, delivering yet another address where I spoke candidly. I declared that there were forces within these sacred walls more inclined to stifle divine truth than to confront it. The crowd responded passionately, but inside, I felt a quiet rage building. Unbeknownst to the public, a clandestine gathering of cardinals was taking place behind sealed doors, far from the flash of cameras. Their aim wasn't to engage in discussion. It was to reach a resolution that would strip me of my position. The Church, throughout its history, has spoken in the light while operating in shadow. Since the days of the apostles, truth and secrecy have intertwined within these halls. But now, the dilemma arose. What happens when shining light on the darkness is met with veils of hidden agendas, all cloaked beneath the name of Christ? This profound question looms over the Vatican and the world, especially in the wake of what I experienced in my vision. It wasn't merely a message of fire and judgment, it was a prophecy of betrayal, revealing not only impending doom, but also the festering decay buried deep within the Church itself. When I revealed that Jesus Christ appeared to me with an urgent warning to expose the concealed truths, it was more than a spiritual calling. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The shadows that lingered behind Vatican walls had no choice but to confront the light, for the secrets within had to come to light. The history of the Church has always been more than just ancient relics and prophecies. It's been about decisions made and kept quiet for decades, perhaps even centuries. Behind those sacred doctrines, there's a darker story of failures, compromises, and justifications that are too uncomfortable to voice and far too dangerous to expose. In the very beginning, the Vatican's veil of secrecy was born not out of greed or malice, but from a need to protect the faith. It was about shielding it from invading empires, heresies, and political threats. However, over time, that protective cover transformed into a mechanism of control. It ceased to be a matter of safeguarding the gospel. Instead, it became a way to guard power, to fortify legacies, and at times, to shelter sins. Pope Leo XIV truly grasped this unsettling reality. His profound vision of Christ shook him profoundly. In his vision, Jesus didn't merely highlight the world's wickedness. He turned the focus inward, exposing the very thrones, the hidden archives, and the well-dressed men in robes who had pledged allegiance not to the truth, but to maintaining control. For generations, popes have manipulated Christ's name like a double-edged sword. They preached mercy, yet used his authority as a justification for their silence. Scandals vanished behind the curtain of doing what was for the good of the Church. Financial misdeeds were brushed off as responsible stewardship while thumbing deals with governments, striking compromises with tyrants, and forming arrangements with bankers, all wrapped up in seemingly moral yet ultimately distant language from the gospel itself. Take the Vatican Bank, for example. It's often viewed as a mysterious fortress, accused of everything from money laundering to the protection of criminal funds and shady deals with ethically questionable regimes. The 1982 collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and the mysterious death of its chairman were both linked back to the tangled financial web of the Vatican. Investigations were initiated, only to be buried quickly. What followed was simply a continuation of silence and shadow. No accountability, just reassignment. The theology wielded within the Church became another form of selective transparency. While the Church claimed to uphold absolute truth, it frequently withheld certain truths deemed too destabilizing for the followers. Documents discussing early disagreements regarding gospel texts, letters among bishops debating Christ's divinity, reports on Marian apparitions that clashed with established doctrine, and even accounts of possession and exorcism that hinted at darker realities. These were all securely stored away in the Apostolic Archive, once ominously dubbed the Archivum Secretum. Recently, the name was altered to shed its foreboding nature, but the secrets remain, locked away from the eyes of those who seek clarity. The atmosphere around the Church has been shrouded in secrecy for far too long. For generations, Christ's name has been invoked to preserve Church unity, creating a protective veil for the faithful. But then came Pope Leo XIV's unsettling vision. In this moment, everything changed. Instead of a comforting presence, Jesus appeared devoid of a smile, delivering warnings rather than gentle words. He was not merely asking, he was condemning, accusing, and his voice resonated with deep sorrow. Leo described Christ's tone as one filled with anguish, stemming from betrayal, not from outside the Church, but from within its very walls. "You've transformed my house into a fortress," Jesus said, guarding your secrets more zealously than your faith. This was more than a personal rebuke. It was an indictment against the Church's structure, which had prioritized secrecy over accountability. Inside the Vatican, there has always been a quiet dread regarding such revelations. It isn't a lack of belief in God that fuels this fear, but rather the careers that have been built on sidestepping uncomfortable truths. There are cardinals who have witnessed corruption but chose to turn a blind eye, bishops who have rewritten history for the sake of stability, and clergy who have donned their silence like armor. But this vision threatened to expose everything. Rather than calling for mere reform, Jesus demanded revelation. Recent years have seen internal Vatican documents emerge, exposing efforts to suppress investigations into abuse, financial discrepancies, and even connections to foreign entities. Investigations were derailed, victims silenced, and whistleblowers exiled, all while Christ's name was used as a closing prayer. Now, however, that name has returned, loud and clear, issuing a stark warning. For the first time, the faithful have begun to ponder a challenging question. If Jesus were to appear today, not as a mural but in the flesh, what would he dismantle first? This inquiry is gaining traction, not merely a passing thought, but a growing concern among pilgrims arriving in Rome. They come not just to pray, they come seeking answers. They want to know why certain documents remain sealed. They question why Christ's name is used to justify wealth, while the impoverished stand at the doors of the basilicas. What truths have been hidden, and why is the Pope facing threats for revealing them? This has created a palpable tension that is not just political but deeply spiritual. If the Church has concealed what Christ wished to have uncovered, then perhaps its greatest crisis lies not in the external world, but within its own structure. According to Pope Leo, Jesus' message did not point fingers at specific individuals or isolated generations. Rather, it was a call for introspection and accountability. I want to share something that has been weighing heavily on my heart. It all began when Pope Leo XIV spoke of a revelation he received. He did not mince words. Instead, he made a frightening observation about the state of the Church and those who represent it. He pointed out that the true threats weren't outside the church walls, like atheists or modern ideologies, but rather from within. His message was clear. The wolves are already in the pulpit, in the palaces, and in the councils. This wasn't just a vague warning, it was a direct statement. The words of Jesus resonate through history, sharp and clear as day. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you whitewashed tombs. These powerful admonitions were never aimed at rebels or skeptics. They were directed at religious leaders, those leaders who present themselves as holy while neglecting the true essence of faith. It was a dangerous message, and it was the same one Pope Leo echoed in his vision, this time aimed squarely at the Church. He did not speak of a gentle Jesus offering comfort. Instead, he painted a picture of a Christ who wept, not for the world, but for the betrayal by his own followers. It wasn't the skeptics who twisted his teachings. It was those who claimed to be his representatives. These were the individuals who recited his words but turned them upside down, preaching humility while seeking power. They defended institutions Christ never envisioned and ignored the straightforward teachings he laid out for everyone to follow. This betrayal was not just a moral failing, it reached to the very foundation of the Church. To Christ, it seemed that something essential had been lost. a deviation from the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount. The church had erected something entirely unrecognizable, built not on the teachings, but on silence. Pope Leo spoke boldly, saying, "You preach in my name, but your hearts serve another king." When he delivered that line beneath the sweeping dome of St. Peter's, an uneasy stillness fell over everyone present. No one dared to break the silence as the weight of those words settled in. This wasn't merely about changing a few policies or initiating minor reforms. It was a bold confrontation. Christ had returned not to reassure the church, but to hold it accountable. And he asked a pivotal question: where does this betrayal start? It doesn't begin with scandals or secrets. It begins with the gradual, quiet abandonment of his voice. His voice echoes from the mountaintop, proclaiming, "Blessed are the poor, love your enemies, do not store up treasures on earth." These aren't mere suggestions. They are commands that must be followed. But look around. The opulence of the Vatican's marble halls, the high security of its vaults, and the intricacies of political alliances, these things seem to reflect a different priority. When you observe the power structures and titles within the Church, it's hard to reconcile them with the simple yet profound values that Christ taught. In a moment of profound reflection, Pope Leo XIV experienced a vision that left him shaken. He saw a stark contrast between the humble Jesus of the Gospels and the Church's current embodiment of power and privilege. It was astounding to witness how far the Church had strayed. The man who once walked barefoot, urging his followers to own nothing, now seemed worlds apart from the papacy that boasted armored vehicles and luxury. Imagine that. A figure who washed the feet of outcasts is now represented by leaders who fly in private jets and shield themselves behind grand fortresses of political power. The very ideals that Jesus embodied, those of humility and servanthood, had been twisted into justification for privilege. This wasn't merely hypocrisy. It felt like a complete inversion of everything Christ stood for. The papal throne, which was once a beacon of service, had become nearly indistinguishable from a royal throne. Concepts like papal infallibility, which were never taught by Jesus, were now wielded as defenses against any form of accountability. The popes, once known for living simply, either in poverty or exile, now found themselves in opulent surroundings, guarded by centuries of political insulation. All the while, they quoted a man who encouraged his followers to embrace suffering, to take the lowest place, and to live as sheep among wolves. It's crucial to remember that Jesus' teachings were meant as clear directions for living. He urged radical love, endless forgiveness, and a fearless commitment to truth, encouraging people to give until their hearts ached, to trust in God rather than wealth, and to serve rather than rule. Yet, through the ages, those instructions shifted into mere ideals, noble suggestions rather than non-negotiable mandates. It was in this shift that the Church betrayed its roots, transforming the gospel into a brand and turning Christ's revolutionary words into something much more palatable and tame. In his vision, Pope Leo was first shown the Church as it had once been, a place for the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. These were individuals who possessed nothing in worldly terms, but owned everything in faith because they had Christ. But then he witnessed the transformation, a structure overly focused on self-preservation, losing sight of its true purpose. He saw theologians who, despite their years of study, had never given their time to serve the needy, and clergy debating doctrine in marble halls while children went hungry just blocks away. It became glaringly clear to him that this was not a matter of doctrine or tradition. It was about the heart. It was the kind of heart that Jesus desired, a heart that prioritizes compassion over sacrifice. It was the kind of faith that doesn't just speak, but one that truly bleeds. It's about love that has a cost, and that's what resonated deeply within him. In a quiet moment of reflection, I found myself grappling with a profound realization. What so many in the church label as strength is often rooted in fear. It's a fear of losing our position of authority, a fear of vulnerability, and a fear of confronting uncomfortable truths. In that state of fear, I witnessed a troubling betrayal. The church had traded its cross for comfort, its voice for silence. It wasn't a denial of Christ's divinity that struck me, but a betrayal of his very example. We speak of miracles, yet neglect the suffering around us. We quote the crucifixion, but shy away from the discomfort it brings. We bow to earthly kings while turning a blind eye to the true kingdom. As those thoughts swirled, I experienced a vision that would change everything. The moment faded, but one phrase lingered, engraved in my heart. You wear my name, but deny my truth. Since that moment, those words have echoed within me, refusing to fade away. Then there was another encounter, different from the grand moments or thunderous experiences we often expect. It was in the stillness of solitude and prayer that I found myself enveloped by something greater than comprehension, a presence that was both gentle and heavy with sorrow, almost too much to bear. I collapsed to my knees, feeling as if I were in the eye of a storm, where silence revealed rather than soothed. In that sacred space, it wasn't Jesus who came to me, but rather his mother, the Virgin Mary. She appeared not in glory or celebration, but as a mother burdened with the weight of her children's neglect. There was no grand speech or warm welcome. I felt a thick sadness in the very air, almost palpable like a fog wrapping around me. When I dared to look up, I was struck by her presence, grief made flesh. She didn't shine like the ethereal images we often see. Instead, she looked like a woman who had witnessed her children tear each other apart for generations. Mary, whose visit was filled with unspoken words, didn't contradict or embellish her son's message. Rather, she affirmed it, holding space for every accusation and every warning he had given us. Her silence spoke volumes, allowing me to feel the heavy burden of being seen, not as the Pope, but simply as a man carrying the weight of a church filled with secrets. These secrets bore judgment, and she allowed me to feel that profound truth. Her voice was both nurturing and unwavering, delivering a chilling message. He warned you, she said, emphasizing the urgency in her tone, and now you must warn them. As he sought solace, it never arrived. Instead, she shared a narrative he had been aware of but had refused to accept fully until this moment. She began by recalling the warnings issued at Fatima. Unless the Church embraced repentance and revealed the truths imparted to it, the consequences for Rome would be unfathomable. The secrecy, the manipulation, the countless excuses, it was all there, woven into the fabric of what she spoke. This isn't merely about a single secret or prophecy, she asserted resolutely. It's about decay and the refusal to face it. Her words hit home as she described priests who had turned their collars into shields and bishops who had hidden behind tradition, shunning the fundamental truth. You speak of me to shield your silence, not to honor my son, she declared, and it rang painfully clear. Her gaze slipped past him, deeper than the physical walls of the Vatican. It felt as if she were penetrating the very core, through the archives and the dim corridors where truths were bartered and secrets exchanged. She didn't need to level accusations. Her mere presence was enough to dismantle every excuse he held. "The Church," she continued, "has constructed a fortress not of stone, but of fear. Fear of shame, fear of scandal, fear of losing control." It struck him then that they had made the same mistake as the Pharisees long ago, trading genuine obedience for mere appearances. She reminded him of Jesus' words during his first vision. "They defend my church as if I cannot," a line now echoing in his mind with intensified significance. They defend me while ignoring him. The irony stung him. Devotion to her, in some circles, had become a diversion from the true gospel her son had sacrificed everything to deliver. What she was here for, she made clear, was not to introduce a new prophecy, but to reinforce a long-established one. She confirmed that time was running short, not in a cataclysmic sense with fire and brimstone, but rather spiritually. The heart of the church was ill, and its ailment was pride. She revealed how heaven had waited for too long. Mercy had already spoken, and now silence would only herald judgment. It was at this moment he realized she hadn't moved. Her eyes remained steady, unblinking, but there were tears held back, almost like they were weary from sorrow. And then came the line that chilled him to the core, uttered without rage or volume, but with a weight that shattered the last remnants of his hope. "It's hard to put into words what happened, but I can tell you that a heavy weight settled on me. I realized that the true challenge lay not in the outside world, the governments, the media, or even the skeptics who continuously questioned faith. No, the harsh reality was that Christ's wrath was directed towards those within the church itself. It was aimed at the shepherds, the ones who claimed to be his voice, the ones in robes and rings who stood at the pulpit, yet chose to twist his message for their own gain. They buried their failures in a cloud of incense and ritual, disregarding his commands. Every compromise I made, every time I held my tongue when I should have spoken out, these moments pressed heavily on my conscience. Mary stood by me during this turmoil. She didn't condemn my failings, nor did she offer the comfort I was looking for. Instead, she acted as a mirror, reflecting back the hard truths I needed to face. Her purpose wasn't to let me escape this reality. It was to ensure I understood the gravity of the situation. Jesus had said it plainly. The church was on trial. My role wasn't to safeguard it, but to put its very foundations to the test. She didn't promise that everything would turn out all right. In fact, she indicated that if there was any chance for salvation, it would hinge on truth that would be far from welcome. She warned me that opposition wouldn't come from outside forces, but from those closest to me, my fellow brothers in faith. Just then, I saw her weep, quietly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle tremor that froze the air around us. Her tears weren't for the world outside, nor for the lost souls, or even the Roman city. Her sorrow was for the church itself. As the weeks passed, something felt off in Rome. It was more than just the usual political tensions. Something intangible had shifted. The air felt different. Once comforting like a tradition, now it was brittle, ready to break. Outside St. Peter's, crowds began gathering every morning. Some arrived carrying candles, and others held protest signs, their eyes filled with a cocktail of hope and fear, murmuring words like judgment and prophecy. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was thick with tension. What was once a sanctuary of calm rituals turned into a space filled with murmured debates and silent glances that lingered a beat too long. It was as if everyone sensed that a storm was brewing, something turbulent on the horizon. The first signs crept in slowly, flickers of lights, sudden storms, and thunder rumbling in completely clear skies. Then came the events that would change everything, capturing the attention of the news across the globe. A few days ago, something strange happened near the Vatican. A sudden sinkhole opened up and swallowed a part of the street. It felt like an omen. Then a storm hit, and lightning struck the top of St. John Lateran, the oldest church in Rome and the Pope's official seat. Tourists pulled out their phones, capturing the moment, while the devoted remained silent, contemplating the significance. Was this mere chance, or was heaven trying to send a message? As these natural events unfolded, social unrest started to brew within Italy. Protests against the Vatican gained momentum, but it wasn't just from atheists or the usual activists. Even devout Catholics were joining in. Some were convinced that Pope Leo's visions were genuine, while others pondered if he had lost his sanity. Yet they all agreed on one point: something was terribly off. Adding to the pressure, wildfires raged in southern Europe and freak floods swept through Spain, compounded by an intense heat wave that scorched the landscape around Rome. The media, while hesitant to use the term judgment, couldn't hide their growing anxiety. It felt tangible, creeping into conversations and broadcasts. Reality, more than any ancient prophecy, was starting to take a toll. Despite the rising tension, the Vatican struggled to defuse the situation. Each new press release felt colder than the last, and efforts to quiet Pope Leo only seemed to amplify his voice. Inside the Vatican, he appeared calm but was grappling with an immense burden. He decided to halt private meetings with some cardinals and canceled various ceremonial appearances. Instead, he found solace in silent chapels and immersed himself in Scripture. Those closest to him noticed he spent longer moments in tears, not out of fear, but from the weight of his revelations. What he witnessed, others refused to notice, and the signs were beginning to align with his visions. The moment arrived for him to speak out again, this time with unwavering conviction. Standing before a restless crowd, his voice rang out like a clarion call. Jesus said, "Judgment begins with the house of God, and we are that house." No applause followed, no cheers. The atmosphere turned heavy, as if time stood still. He wasn't there to console, he was calling for accountability, and that reality struck fear into more hearts than any prophecy could. He spoke not merely as a pope, but as a prophet, a man who had shed the desire to maintain the old structures and was instead preparing for what was to come. With urgency, he warned of more signs ahead, cautioning that resistance would only harden the inevitable blow. Then, in a moment that surprised everyone, he declared a pilgrimage unlike any seen before, traveling from city to city, nation to nation, with a call to repentance. It wasn't a journey steeped in tradition, it was a call for reckoning. Pope Leo XIV found himself at a crucial crossroads, feeling a burden that was almost unbearable. He shared that true mercy required the Church to own its past mistakes and to show genuine humility. Only then could it ask others to do the same. He posed a profound question. How could a shepherd lead lost souls if he chose to remain lost himself? His plan was bold and unprecedented. In secret discussions, Vatican security was in a frenzy, and his inner circle urged him to rethink his intentions. But there was no wavering in his resolve. This message, he insisted, was imperative. If they chose silence, they would face ruin. Taking action, however risky, might lead to redemption. The pilgrimage he envisioned would trace the roots of faith, starting in Fatima, then making its way to Jerusalem, South America, and finally the United States. He rejected the idea of delivering proclamations from thrones or altars. Instead, he wanted to speak from the very ground where people had suffered, places where the church had faltered. It would be his mission to confess those truths that others refused to acknowledge, to express remorse for the silence, cover-ups, and arrogance that had persisted for centuries. This audacious plan wasn't sanctioned by the Vatican, and their attempts to deter him were futile. For the first time in living memory, a pope was charting his own course without seeking permission. The wheels were now in motion, plans were made discreetly, flight paths were charted under false names. The media remained blissfully unaware, as did the world at large, but his closest advisors were not oblivious. Yet, their fear didn't stem from concerns of safety or political fallout. It was born from the uncertainty of what might unfold if his mission ignited a genuine spiritual awakening. The very fabric of the church could be transformed. With unwavering determination, this was a man who had spoken with Jesus, cried with Mary, and dared to challenge centuries of silence. Pope Leo XIV was set to lead a global pilgrimage dedicated to repentance. Deep beneath the apostolic palace, in a dimly lit chamber hidden from the bustling tourists, a table lay enveloped in dust, covered with long-forgotten documents. Some were penned with trembling hands, others were typed on yellowed pages by secretaries long gone. These writings had been cloistered away for decades, but the moment of their release was at hand. Standing at the threshold of this lost room, Leo's gaze was locked onto the stacks that commanded the attention of both heaven and hell. For too long, those pages had been buried, protected not by chains but by an atmosphere of fear. They contained the accounts of Fatima, letters from Sister Lucia, and private correspondence of previous popes, all now poised to be unveiled. He didn't have to say much to the archivists by his side. Their selection was deliberate. They were priests who already understood the significance of this moment. The church was on the brink of transformation, and this pilgrimage was only the beginning. Among the believers, there were men who had witnessed a vision firsthand. They sensed the deep sorrow in my voice as I recounted what Jesus had shown me. It was a powerful moment. Some of the men shed tears, others made the sign of the cross in silence, while one collapsed to his knees in prayer. This wasn't mere speculation or wild theories. These were truths, warnings, and testimonies that the church had long buried. For years, the world waited for these revelations, and now it was time to unveil them to everyone. As we approached the announcement, a heavy silence descended over Rome. Not a tranquil stillness, but one thick with anticipation, like the calm before a raging storm. Gone were the usual Vatican press releases, and even the typically cheerful cardinals seemed to have vanished from sight. Inside the corridors of power, something was clearly shifting. Some called it chaotic, while others thought of it as prophecy coming to light. Initially, whispers of leaks started surfacing. A letter here, a quotation there, and even a blurred image of a sealed document with SSS Subsecretorio Sanctissimo stamped on it. One headline caught my eye: The Pope has the files, now what? It wasn't even about whether I would unveil the information. I had everything laid out, translations complete, logistics secured, and a precise date and time ready for the big reveal. The true question was whether the Church would allow this to happen. I held the keys, but the fortified walls of tradition were more robust than they appeared, harboring influential figures invested in maintaining the status quo. Behind closed doors, secret meetings unfolded with cardinals, bishops, and advisors converging from every corner of the Vatican. They spoke of what they had begun to label as the threat, not the threat of lies, but the peril of unvarnished truth. Some feared that disclosing these documents might incite worldwide turmoil, while others worried it would lay bare deep-rooted failures about the Church's history, failures that seemed irreparable. But I was undeterred. I had heard these arguments before. I understood the risks, and oddly enough, I embraced them. Jesus hadn't asked me to uphold reputations. He tasked me with speaking boldly. One particular document overwhelmed even me. It was an envelope marked for my eyes only, written by Sister Lucia. Inside, she laid out not just the visions of Mary, but a direct warning from Jesus about the Vatican, about Rome, and about those shepherds who had turned into wolves. The message was strikingly clear, naming specific locations, alluding to concealed crimes, and foretelling a final hour when silence could no longer be accepted. I found myself standing on the brink of something monumental, a moment the world had been waiting for. Pilgrims camped outside the Vatican, a sea of believers lighting candles and praying fervently, hoping for a change long overdue. They weren't just hoping for tradition or protocol to guide us. They longed for the true teachings of Christ, the very essence of what their faith was built upon. However, I couldn't ignore the tension brewing inside the Vatican's walls. High-ranking officials had begun preparing their defenses, crafting legal strategies and internal mandates, all while the conversation veered dangerously close to declaring me unfit to lead, a move not seen in centuries. The weight of it all was suffocating. These were the same men who pledged to protect the gospel, yet here they were, plotting to suppress the very words of Christ that I was ready to share. Despite their schemes, I felt a calm determination washing over me. My role was never to decide the outcome. Rather, it was to unveil the truth that had long been buried. I confided in my closest advisors, "It's not my place to dictate what happens next. We must ensure that the truth can be brought to light." Now it was up to them, the faithful, the believers, to show whether their allegiance lay with power or with Christ. As the moment of revelation approached, an almost serene atmosphere enveloped the Vatican. The square was stark yet filled with light, each candle flickering like a heartbeat, while every window glowed softly as if the very structure was holding its breath in anticipation. We'd prepared backups, encoded digital versions of the documents just in case they tried to silence me. The truth, once awakened, would not slip back into the shadows. Here we stood, at the threshold of history. I wasn't just wearing white, I was bringing forth a fire, a challenge for the Church to emerge from behind its stained glass and confront the world. The eyes of the world were upon us, eager to see if the Vatican would heed the voice of Christ. Would those sworn to protect the gospel choose to follow its true author, or would they cling to their comfort, abandoning the essence of their faith? The moment was inescapably close. The files were ready, the atmosphere charged, but the question lingered. Would they choose to obey, or would they turn their backs? You won't want to miss what's coming next. Seriously, stay tuned for the following chapter. There's so much more to unfold. If you find this interesting, share the video and don't forget to subscribe for future updates. Just imagine, the next hour might just turn everything upside down.